What if everything standing between you and a slow, freezing death in the open desert fit inside a single leather sack? No insulated sleeping bag, no portable gas stove, no synthetic base layer, no weather forecast, no emergency beacon. Just the desert night closing in around you, temperatures dropping 40 degrees in under 3 hours, wind cutting sideways across the flats, and the absolute certainty that if you stopped moving and did nothing, you would not wake up. Now imagine that was not a survival emergency. That was Tuesday. That was every night on the trade routes of ancient Egypt, and the men responsible for those routes, the caravan guards who moved gold, linen, spices, and grain across hundreds of miles of open desert, did not merely endure it, they managed it, they cooked in it, they slept in it, and they did it with a precision that had nothing to do with luck. Most people, when they think about desert survival, think about heat, the sun, the blinding, relentless, hammering heat of midday. And that instinct is not wrong. The Sahara's daytime temperatures can push past 120 degrees Fahrenheit in certain seasons, and the Egyptian desert shows no mercy to anyone unprepared for that kind of exposure. But here's the part the popular image leaves out. The part that changes everything once you understand it. The desert does not hold heat. It releases it. The moment the sun drops below the horizon, the ground that spent all day radiating enough energy to cook meat begins shedding that warmth at a rate that modern observers consistently underestimate. By midnight, temperatures in the deep desert can fall below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Before dawn, they can drop further still, and if there is wind, which there usually is, the effective cold reaches deep into unprotected muscle. Heat isn't just temperature, it's time, and the desert owns both. The caravan guards of ancient Egypt understood this in a way that went beyond instinct. It was operational knowledge, passed through generations, embedded in the physical design of their equipment, their camp routines, their food preparation systems, and the specific way they organized bodies in the dark. This was not magic. It was not mysticism. It was engineering. And when you break it down piece by piece, it reveals a level of environmental intelligence that quietly dismantles the assumption that ancient desert travelers were simply tougher than us, or more tolerant, or running on some biological hardware we no longer possess. They weren't tougher. They were smarter. The difference matters. Before going further, there is a cliché worth dismantling directly. The image most people carry of ancient caravan life tends toward two extremes, either romantic, robed figures gliding serenely through golden dunes at sunset, or brutal, a death march through hostile terrain held together by willpower alone. Both are wrong, or at least both are incomplete in ways that miss the actual story. The real picture is closer to a precision logistics operation, where every element of the camp system served a specific thermal function, where cooking was not separate from warmth management, and where the arrangement of sleeping bodies followed rules that had been refined over time into something approaching science. When you understand that, the desert stops looking like a punishment and starts looking like a medium those guards had learned to read. And that's when the real problem starts. Because reading the desert correctly meant understanding that surviving the cold required decisions made hours before the cold arrived. The first piece of the system was fire, but not in the way you might assume. Open fires in the desert are deceptive. They produce enormous visible heat at close range and almost no retained warmth at any distance. A guard sitting directly in front of a fire might feel comfortable. Move 2 feet to the side, and the wind strips that warmth away instantly. The solution that many researchers and reconstructions point to, based on excavated camp remnants, cooking tool designs, and documented practices in adjacent desert cultures of the same period, was the contained fire. Not a bonfire. A deep pit lined with stone, narrow at the top, wide at the base, designed specifically to hold heat within the cooking structure itself, rather than radiating it out into the open air. This design accomplished 2 things simultaneously. First, it made cooking possible in high wind without the flame being extinguished. Second, and more importantly, for the cold problem, it turned the pit itself into a thermal storage device. Stone absorbs heat. It does not release it instantly. A pit that burned for 2 to 3 hours during the evening meal preparation could retain enough warmth in its walls to serve a secondary function once the cooking was done. Some evidence suggests that guards would move the remaining coals to the edges of the sleeping area, using flat stone slabs to radiate low, sustained heat through the first hours of the night. Not enough to stay warm on its own, enough to be part of a system that, in combination with other elements, made the difference between functional rest and dangerous exposure. Nothing worked in isolation. That is the central fact of desert thermal management, and it applies as much to the caravan camp as it does to the Egyptian house, or the granary, or the irrigation channel. The pit fire connected to the sleeping arrangement. The sleeping arrangement connected to the windbreak. The windbreak connected to the choice of camp location. Every decision fed into the next, and a failure at any point reduced the effectiveness of everything else. The second piece was animal heat, and here the picture requires some precision, because it is easy to either overstate or understate what camels and donkeys contributed to the thermal equation. They contributed enormously. A large pack animal produces a consistent, sustained heat output that, when channeled correctly, can raise the effective temperature of a sheltered space by a meaningful margin. Caravan guards did not sleep away from their animals out of preference. The proximity was functional, arranging the sleeping area on the lee side of a resting camel, or between 2 animals positioned perpendicular to the prevailing wind, reduced wind exposure, and added passive warmth without any additional fuel cost. But here's the part nobody expects. The animals also dictated the geometry of the camp. Because the guards were responsible for the safety of the cargo and the animals, they could not cluster too tightly or position themselves in ways that compromised their ability to respond quickly. The thermal arrangement and the security arrangement had to be the same arrangement. A formation that kept the men warm also had to keep them positioned to detect movement, respond to sound, and protect the animals from predators or raiders. Efficiency in one domain had to serve efficiency in the other. That kind of integrated thinking is not simple. It requires the kind of cumulative operational knowledge that comes from running the same routes in the same conditions across many seasons. Cold is not just discomfort, it is impairment, and impaired guards are dead guards. The third piece was the food system, and this is where the engineering becomes genuinely surprising. Cooking in the deep desert was not simply a matter of producing calories. It was a matter of producing the right kind of calories, at the right time, in a form that would continue producing internal heat for the hours when no external fire was available. Evidence from similar cultural and environmental contexts, along with analysis of plant remains and cooking vessel types associated with ancient Egyptian desert-adjacent sites, points toward food preparations that were dense, fat-heavy, and slow digesting. Grain cakes cooked directly on heated stone, legume pastes with significant oil content, dried meat rehydrated with minimal water and consumed hot. The logic behind this is physiological, and it is precise. Fat metabolism generates more sustained internal heat than carbohydrate metabolism. A meal dominated by fats and proteins, consumed in the early evening, will continue producing internal warmth through the hours of deepest cold, roughly 2 to 4 in the morning, in a way that a carbohydrate-heavy meal does not. This was almost certainly not understood in the biochemical terms we would use today, but it did not need to be. Experience teaches pattern. Guards who ate certain combinations of food on cold nights survived them better. Over generations, those combinations became standard. The knowledge was embedded in the practice before anyone had words for the mechanism. And that's when the real complexity reveals itself. Because the food had to be prepared with almost no water to spare. Water was not available in the quantities that cooking, as most people imagine it, requires. Everything had to be designed around water scarcity. That meant cooking methods that used heat efficiently, not water abundantly. Stone surface cooking. Fat as both fuel and food. Or grain ground fine enough to cook quickly and thoroughly without extended boiling. The thermal efficiency of the evening meal was inseparable from the water management of the entire route. Again, nothing in isolation. Every constraint fed into every solution, and every solution had to serve multiple functions at once. The fourth piece was clothing and wrapping. And here the desert guards had something that many outside observers have assumed was merely cultural, the multi-layered linen wrap, which was in fact a piece of thermal technology that responded intelligently to the desert's dual nature. Linen is breathable. During the day, it allows evaporative cooling while blocking direct solar radiation. At night, layered linen traps the thin air between its sheets, and creating an insulation effect that is not as efficient as wool or modern synthetics, but is significantly better than nothing, and far better than the alternatives available in that context. The wrapping method mattered as much as the material. Reconstructions based on iconographic evidence and textile analysis suggest that desert travelers used a single large piece of linen in a way that allowed it to be reconfigured between day and night functions, draped loosely over the shoulders and head during the day, wound tightly around the core, and pulled over the extremities at night. The same piece of cloth performing two opposite thermal functions within the same 24-hour period. That is not primitive. That is adaptive design operating within severe material constraints. Some researchers have noted that in certain periods and regions, camel wool or animal fiber blankets supplemented the linen, particularly for night travel during the cooler months when the cold was most severe. The layering combination, animal fiber against linen against body, would have approached the insulation profile of modern expedition-light gear in terms of effective temperature management without any of the synthetic materials. The mechanism was different. The result was comparable. But here's the part nobody expects when they first encounter this information. The guards often did not sleep in extended individual positions. They slept in compressed communal configurations that maximized shared body heat and minimized surface area exposed to the wind. This was not a cultural preference. It was a calculated thermal decision. A group of 6 or 8 bodies, arranged tightly, sharing a common wrap or multiple overlapping wraps, facing away from the prevailing wind, positioned against the thermal mass of resting animals, conserves heat at a rate that individual sleeping cannot approach. The mathematics of heat loss favor the group almost exponentially. One body radiating heat into open air loses that heat quickly. 8 bodies sharing a common thermal envelope lose it at a fraction of the rate. Heat is not produced by the desert. It is conserved by those who understand where to put it. The 5th piece was timing, and this is where the precision of the system becomes most visible. Caravan movement in the deep desert was not random. Routes were known, distances were calculated, and the timing of camps was not incidental. Guards operating on the established trade routes, the ones running between the Nile Valley, the oases, and the trading posts on the desert margins, worked with accumulated knowledge about where wind accelerated, where terrain provided natural shelter, where the ground retained enough daytime warmth to make a significant difference to a sleeping body pressed against it. Certain rock formations, certain valley configurations, certain positions relative to dune lines reduced wind exposure dramatically while preserving the residual ground heat that the desert surface held from the afternoon sun. Choosing the right camp position was not about comfort. It was about surviving the pre-dawn hours, which consistently represented the highest mortality risk for any poorly prepared desert traveler. The decision of where to stop had to be made well before the cold arrived, because by the time the cold was felt, the opportunity to choose correctly had already passed. Some evidence suggests, and this is more interpretive than factual, that senior guards carried navigational and environmental knowledge that went beyond route directions. They knew the thermal profile of specific campsites the way a ship's captain might know the current patterns of a particular strait. That knowledge was the most valuable thing they carried, more valuable than any weapon, more valuable than any cargo. Because without it, the cargo did not arrive. Nothing worked in isolation. Not the fire, not the food, not the clothing, not the animal positioning, not the camp location. The system only functioned when all of its pieces operated together, each compensating for the limitations of the others, each amplified by the presence of everything else. Remove any one element, and the remaining ones degraded. Add one element without the others, and it could not carry the load alone. This is the pattern that repeats across ancient Egyptian environmental engineering, from the architecture of the houses along the Nile, to the granary systems, to the management of floodwater. Not maximization, optimization, not making more, losing less. The goal was never to overpower the environment. The goal was to work within it so precisely that the environment's own forces became part of the solution. The desert at night is one of the most hostile environments a human body can encounter without modern equipment. Temperature swing, wind chill, dehydration, disorientation, predator activity. And yet the caravan guards who maintained the trade routes of ancient Egypt did not merely survive those nights. They maintained operational effectiveness through them. They cooked, they rested, they watched, and they moved on at first light, season after season, decade after decade, carrying the economic blood of one of the ancient world's most complex civilizations across terrain that, by any modern casual assessment, should have been impassable without technology that wouldn't exist for another 2,000 years. What you assumed was endurance was actually precision. Yet what looked like toughness was actually knowledge. What seemed like a question of survival was actually a question of systems. And the people who built those systems understood something about the relationship between human bodies and extreme environments that we are only now beginning to recover, translate, and apply. This is not myth. This is not legend. This is engineering that survived because it worked, and the desert kept the receipts. The question worth sitting with is this: if people without a single piece of modern technology could crack the code of one of the planet's most extreme thermal environments using only observation, material ingenuity, and accumulated knowledge, what else did they solve that we haven't looked at closely enough yet? If this question pulled you in, then you are exactly the kind of person who will want to see what comes next. We are going deep into the systems that made ancient Egyptian civilization function at the edges of what physics says should have been possible. Not the monuments, not the pharaohs, but the invisible engineering underneath everything. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because the next video goes somewhere most history channels never look. The food preservation systems that kept desert trade routes alive across distances, that modern logistics engineers still find difficult to explain without refrigeration. The answers are not what you expect. They never are. Hit subscribe, and we will see you there.